Silence, please. All stand.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Yoorrook Justice Commission, which is now in session. Thank you.
Be seated, please. The Yoorrook Justice Commission is now in session.
We welcome everybody here present today at Charcoal Lane for the second week of the Yoorrook-Churang, the public hearings, at which we are receiving truth-telling evidence from elders, and later this week some further evidence from the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. Thank you. Council.
Commissioner Hunter.
Sorry.
Did you want me to acknowledge country?
It's on the running sheet. So
sorry.
The smoking, sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri and pay my respects to elders past and present, and all our elders that have gotten us this far here, and particularly Aunty Faye, that your elders and ancestors are with us today, and may Bunja watch over us as we conduct Aboriginal business. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hunter.
Thank you, Chair. The first order of business is to acknowledge that this morning's witness is Aunty Faye Carter, and that she is a sister of Commissioner Atkinson. The second order is that we seek two orders in relation to publication of material that may cover some sensitive information, and subject to Aunty Faye Carter's wishes before that evidence is led later today. We seek these two orders in anticipation that there may be a private session and non-publication of some of that material. So the two orders are before you, Chair. The first order is in respect of Section 24 of the Inquiries Act. We seek the order set out on that paper to close part of the session as set out in Order 1 and post a copy of the order on the door here, and also publish this order on the website. So I seek the order in these terms.
Thank you, Council. I make each of these orders in the terms sought and direct that they be published on Yoorrook's website, that the orders be published on Yoorrook's website.
The Commission pleases. I will signal when we get to the point in the evidence where we need to close the session and for non-publication.
Thank you, Council. Thank you.
Commission pleases. The first witness, as I've indicated, is Aunty Faye Carter, or Faye Priscilla Carter, and Aunty Faye has indicated that she wishes to give an undertaking to tell the truth with her garni or digging stick, and would seek to do that now.
Aunty Faye, do you solemnly undertake to provide truthful evidence to the Yoorrook Justice Commission at today's Yoorrook-Churang?
I say ja, which is ja Wurrung for yes. Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Aunty, can I just ask that you put that microphone a little towards you? It helps in the room to amplify your voice a little bit, so I can hear you over here. Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Is that better?
Yeah, is that better?
That's very good, thank you. Aunty, may I call you Aunty Faye for the purpose of these proceedings?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Aunty, you've prepared, with the assistance of the lawyers and others assisting the Commission, a Balet Ki Tiara or witness statement.
Yes.
Have you had a chance to read that witness statement through?
Ja.
And is it true and correct?
Ja.
Could I invite you first, Aunty, to introduce your family members sitting with you and also in the hearing room.
Yes, I'd love to do that. Sitting next to me, I've got my daughter Wendy Berwick and my son Rodney Carter, two precious children that I'm very proud of their achievements throughout their life. And if I look down in the gallery, I see my beautiful family. I see my grandsons, Drew and Josh. Sitting next to Josh is my dear niece, Gabrielle. She's actually Wayne's daughter. Then who else can I see? I see my beautiful sister Marlene and her husband Paul. My sister-in-law Kath. Dear Jess sitting there, not family, but really the way she's worked with me has made her like family. Then I've got Dan, my granddaughter Niani's fiance, who I've grown very fond of, Dan. Then I've got, my beautiful granddaughter Natasha, who I'm so proud of. I've got Elise, Drew's partner. Is there anybody else there? I'm sorry. Oh, Niani, my granddaughter Niani is doing some work on her computer. She couldn't sort of get out of that, so she'll be in and out with her computer. Gosh, these computers have become part of our life, haven't they? But I'm so proud of my family. I'm proud of their achievements, each and every one of them. And, you know, it all stems from and comes from our ancestry. We've had such wonderful ancestors, old people in our lives that have passed down us being able to achieve what we have today. So, and I thank them very much for being here with me and supporting me. And can I talk about the digging stick now or later?
Yes, certainly.
I've got two precious things with me. Firstly, if I could say, I've got my digging stick, which is a Ghani in Jarjara language. My granddaughter Natasha, who's sitting under there, stand up, Natasha. Oh. Yeah, that's my granddaughter Natasha. She went on country and got this piece of wood off a wattle tree. She pared it down and made it smooth, and then she did the emblems on them, which are very, very significant. At the top is me, if you can see that. A little bit further down is my two children, Wendy and Rodney. And then further down are my 6 grandchildren. And so it's very precious to me. Not just the meaning of the symbols, but that my granddaughter has made this for me. I'm wearing a possum skin cloak that was made by my son, Rodney. I had a long one, but I used to trip over it. So Rodney decided, no, Mum, you need a short one. So he made this one that just comes below my mum. And you know what mum means, don't you? So it's short and more comfortable. And so I thank Rodney for that. And I thank Natasha for these beautiful symbols that I've got with me today. Aren't I a lucky person? You know, here I go. And Nick's going to cry too, I know. I'm so lucky. I'm so lucky to have the family that I have and the support and love and care that I get. And you know, when I say my name is Faye Priscilla Carter, My mother nicknamed me Fifth or Fiffy, and my siblings, Wayne in particular, my siblings still call me Fifth. So that's significant to record as well, that it's a special name for me that came from my mother's lips. Okay.
Thank you, Aunty, for that lovely introduction and for explaining and sharing with us the story about your special objects. Could I invite you to tell us about, to introduce yourself in a culturally appropriate way, to say where you're from and where your country is.
Okay. So I've sort of written myself some notes here, and I do that because I get tracked, sidetracked. And when I go anywhere to give a talk, I always apologise for having to read what I've written. And I say to them, if I don't read what I've written, I'll go off track and I'll just start talking about how deadly my grandchildren are. and of course they are deadly. But so I usually sort of make myself some notes. So I've apologised here that I've written down what I want to say. As I say, my name's Faye Priscilla Carter, Nee Johnson. I'm not sure whether I've sort of said enough about family, but I've sort of written down here that my mother was living on the Cumbergunja Mission when I was ready to be born. And because of medical issues, she was taken into the Echuca Hospital. However, I was born on the veranda of the Echuca Hospital because in those days they didn't take the Aboriginal mothers into the wards with the non-Aboriginal mothers. When I was 16, my mother got me a job at the Echuca Hospital. She was already working there as a cook. She got me a job as a wards maid in the hospital. And the day I started, she took me by the hand. She said, "Come on, Fifth, I want to take you and show you a special spot." And she took me to the veranda where I was born. She didn't think there was anything wrong with that. She was quite happy to be outside on the veranda. But of course, at my age, I'd started to realise what racism was all about. So I wasn't happy with it. I wasn't happy with finding that out. But it's part of my story, so I need to share it with people and to talk about it. Because when you talk about these things, it's like a healing process. It helps you heal, but it doesn't stop you from crying. Okay.
Thank you, Aunty. Just to give you some level of reassurance, the things that are in your witness statement, what's written down, will be part of the evidence that you give. So the story that's captured in the witness statement will be part of your story, and we can talk. I'll ask you some questions to tell some of those stories, but if we don't talk about it, it will be there as part of your evidence in the witness statement.
Yes, thanks, Fiona.
Now, you mentioned the Echuca Hospital. Where is the country of your people?
Yes, well, I belong to two, I'm linked to two tribes, Yoorrook through my grandmother Priscilla and Jajavrung through my grandfather George. And I've also got a great-grandmother, Granny Mag, who was Waywuru. Mm-hmm. And but we sort of aren't totally connected to that country for a number of reasons.
So those who are following the Commission understand, where roughly is Yorta country?
Yorta country's in the Goulburn Valley, and Jajavrung country's central Victoria. Bendigo is probably the centre of Jajavrung country.
And Echuca is up in the north of the state on the river?
Yes, Echuca is probably central, and Wayne might help me out here. Our clan of the Yoorrook is central to that area. Willithica is the clan of the Yoorrook, and so I'd say Echuca is central to that area of our clan, Willithica.
So does it extend on both sides of the Murray River?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes, that sometimes becomes an issue, that because we didn't make the boundaries of New South Wales and Victoria, they were made by white man. We had both sides, the Murray River, as our country for Yoorrook.
Mm. And roughly how far north of the river does the Yoorrook land extend up into New South Wales?
Oh gosh, that's something I'm probably not quite au fait with.
That's fine. In terms of growing up in Kamarunja, that was an Aboriginal mission. Right? And you were born in Echuca and then raised on Kamarunja. Were you there, living there, when the walk-off occurred?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So could you tell the commissioners about the walk-off?
Yes, and I wasn't actually raised on Kamarunja. I was there until I was 4 years old
Yes.
when the walk-off from Kamarunja occurred.
Okay.
And the walk-off, of course, occurred because of the harsh treatment to our people, and that they weren't allowed to speak their language, weren't allowed to practice anything cultural. And so a lot of the families, and our family was one of them, walked off in protest against that treatment that was received on the mission. And if I can talk about where I was
Yes, please.
raised, most of the families, mine included, ended up in a fringe dwelling situation at the Flats, which is a community that came together of those families that walked off Kamarunja to live on the Flats. And they first of all camped, and it was on the Goulburn River, just outside Maroubna, not far from Shepparton, probably in between Shepparton and Maroubna, in the Goulburn Valley. And I was raised there, and I'm so privileged, even though it was hard times, I'm privileged to have had that experience of being raised in that situation and learning and understanding just what racism does to a people, and learning how we survived. And we survived because, you know, they say Aboriginal people are a sharing, caring people. Let me tell you, they were the true days of sharing and caring. That's how we survived, because we shared and we cared for one another. The homes were built by clever old man, let me tell you. They, cut down posts from the trees to make the posts to build the homes. The old women used to sit and sew together the bags for the walls. They'd crush out the kerosene tins flat for the roofs and the chimneys. And I can remember once the walls were put up and the roof was put on, us children were given flour and boiling water to make paste, and they'd collected over time while the camps were being built. They collected magazines, newspaper and whatever, and it was us kids' responsibility to mix the paste the the paste onto the papers that were collected and put them on the walls, on the bag walls, and that created, what do you call it? Insulation. And but it was funny because my grandmother, who was a very strict nanny, made them paste the papers upside down so that we couldn't read them. Yeah, she didn't want us to know too much about the outside world. Okay, yeah.
So the newspapers are on the walls. Were you speaking language in those homes, on the flats?
Well, I get asked many times about this, particularly my children have questioned this. Why didn't the old people teach us the language? And I firmly believe, and I state this quite often, that they did not pass the language on to us because they did not want us to get into trouble like they did. They did not want us to get into trouble speaking our language like they got into trouble for speaking the language. But of course they drop words here and there, and we keep those words going as much as we can. We keep them in the forefront of some of the things that we're talking about. But we can't fluently speak the language. But the old people used to gather in a little circle by themselves and chuff us children off, and they'd talk to one another in language.
You mentioned your grandmother. Can you tell us something about her?
Oh, look, she was the most wonderful. I'd need lots of time to tell you about her. She was a clever old lady. She was very caring, very strict, but in a loving way. She raised 19 children on that riverbank.
She raised how many?
19. Nieces and nephews, and yeah, she raised 19 children, keeping them away from welfare, feeding them, clothing them, educating them. She was amazing how she did that in this meagre environment that she was trying to survive in. But she did it, and that, proves just how strong she was.
And can you tell the commissioners about your mother?
I had a beautiful mother, and I've got a story to tell about her when we're ready to tell it.
We might leave the story about what happened to your mother till later. When you were little and growing up on the flats, had she lived on the mission with her mother?
Oh, yes. Yeah. She was born on the Cumberguncha mission, my mother, and she lived there, for most of her ages up to teenage. My mother and the women of that age, and men as well, they left the rearing of the children to the old people because they had to go out and work. And the work that they did, of course, was on the orchards, picking fruit, out in the fields, picking tomatoes, beans, peas, whatever. That's the sort of work that the younger people in the family had to do, in the families, not just my family, and to survive, and yes.
Were the families very resourceful in finding things for the house? And
Oh gosh, yes.
yeah, could you give us some examples of that?
We had a tip over the highway from the flats where we lived, called Dash's Paddock, and that's where people all round used to take and dump things that they didn't want or didn't need anymore. And that tip furnished our homes. The men and some of the women used to go over to the tip and bring back tables, chairs, cupboards, you name it, whatever. And my grandmother used to, she was pretty fussy. She used to mix what we called phenol. It was a disinfectant, and she'd mix that in a bucket of water, and she'd disinfect all the things that were brought back and before they went into our home. And I'll tell you a little story that once her and one of the old aunties, Aunty Ollie Muir, they went across to the tip and they found a big roll of old lino and they dragged it back. Now, it's a fair way and over the highway. They dragged it back down to the flats and they laid it out and cut it in half. Aunty Ollie took half for her front room and Nanny put hers in her front room. And we thought we were very flash. We thought we were very flash, having lino on our floor. And people from the other camps used to come around just to have a look at what it looked like to have lino on the dirt floor.
Did your grandmother have a sewing machine?
Oh, did she ever? She had a sewing machine that I'm calling this Garni precious and this possum skin precious, and that machine is very precious to me. It would be maybe 150 years old now, and it had been around the traps, let me tell you, and it became very dilapidated. So I gathered some funds together and I had it refurbished, and it looks beautiful now. It's in my lounge room and it's got a special place there in my lounge room.
What would she make with the sewing machine? What sort of things?
Well, we used to have concerts in those days. We used to have many concerts all around the little towns around the Goulburn Valley, and because our people were beautiful singers, we had what they call the Cumragunja Choir, that's name and still bandied around these days, and most of the descendants from that old Cumragunja Choir are still beautiful singers. So we had beautiful singers in the concert, and we also had good dancers, and I was one of those. And the money that was raised from having the concerts, they donate to the war effort and to, different welfare groups. So they did a really good job with that. And even during that war effort time, women on the mission used to gather together and have knitting days, and they'd knit socks and balaclavas for the soldiers. And, I don't think many people know just how resourceful and how caring and giving our people were. Yes.
You mentioned welfare before. Were welfare visiting on the flats?
Oh gosh, yes. They'd just walk in with no notice. They'd just walk in, walk through, checking everything out and checking to see if there was enough food, checking who was sleeping where, and they really were heavy people. My grandmother used to save, how you get lots of food in different cans, like fruit or baked beans or powdered milk or whatever. My grandmother used to save those cans, and she'd fill them up with dirt, put the lids back on, put them high up in the cupboard so that when the welfare came, they could look up there and say, oh, she's pretty well stocked with food. She's really looking after these kids. Yeah. So she was very clever, Sometimes a bit sneaky, that might sound, but I think it was very clever.
And just to understand that or explain that, she did that so that welfare were not threatening to take away the children.
Oh, gosh, yes. All the time. She had that in her head that she was having to look after children. And you know, that's all she did. All she ever did was look after children. Anybody could bring their children there and she'd look after them.
She also had, or asked you to and others to get the damaged cans from the Latona cannery.
Yeah, because we used to go and two of my mother's sisters, Aunty Lulla and Aunty Marky, they married New South Wales Aboriginal men, and they ended up living on a fringe dwelling place like the flats called Wattle Hill in New South Wales, just outside Leeton, and we'd travel up there by train and stay with them for quite some time. And just on that, travelling on train, Nanny would take her machine on the train. And that's how special that machine was to her. And we'd stay up there for a while, yeah.
And what about the cans? From the
Oh, and we'd walk to the school in Leeton, about 8 k's it was, that we had to walk from Wattle Hill into the school in Leeton. And we'd have to pass the Latona cannery. And they had a tip where they used to throw out damaged cans. Nothing wrong with the contents, just that the cans were damaged, they couldn't put the labels on them. So my grandmother knew every can what its contents were by the numbers on the base of the can. Like there'd be, you know, C22, B25. My grandmother knew what was in that can by that name, that letter quoted. So she'd write down a list before we left for school. I want 3 cans of B25, 2 cans of C at 26, and so on. And we'd have to go to the tip on the way home from the school and collect those cans and bring them home. And you know, that helped us survive. That fed us.
We have some videos of you talking about your life, your early life, that I want to play to you. So there's 2 videos. We'll play them one after the other, and then we'll talk a little bit about those videos, okay? So the first one, Commissioners, you don't have the list yet, but the first one will be part of Exhibit 3 in due course. It'll be Exhibit 3.5. Interview with Aunty Faye Carter, entitled Your Home Was Where Your People Were, produced by the Koori Heritage Trust. And the second will be 3.6, and we'll get this list for you, is a video entitled Resisting Colonial Rule, Deadly and Proud Treaty Campaign. Aunty, can you see the screen there?
Yep.
Yep.
Oh, there's my lovely track.
Just pause it while we get the volume working. Maybe go back to the start.
No. Can you? They can't see.
That's all right. They're just dealing with the technology.
Look at the black hair. You like it?
I can remember we did go to Melbourne for a while. I think during the war years there was employment, I guess, for Aboriginal people because of the factories, you know, and the ammunition factories. But then after the war, white people were given the jobs instead of Kooris, so they moved back to areas like this, and where there was seasonal work, where there was water close to the rivers. things like that. Well, right through here, I was sort of looking before, trying to imagine exactly where our house was, and I'd say it was just sort of over in that area there. And there was houses right through here, and when I say houses, they were makeshift houses built by the men in the community, and they used to cut down these strong saplings and make posts, and they'd get bags from, I can remember the women used to sit down and sew the bags together to make the walls, and they'd get kerosene tins and beat them out for the roofs. We had dirt floors. I can remember some of the women used to get down and scrub their floors. Floors used to end up really hard, like concrete. The women used to make brooms out of the young saplings, and they tied them together at the top. Every morning you'd see the women out around the camps splashing water around to settle the dust, and then they'd sweep with these makeshift brooms. But they used to keep the camps really clean. When they first came here, there were tents, that they would have got from relief places, church groups and that, and then they started to make more permanent homes. We used to move a lot to different, and camp at different orchards, for work, but always came back that, that was our base. And the women used to cook outside in the camp ovens over the campfires. And the men built a couple of pulleys, I call them. They used to set up wires down into the river and let buckets down and pull the water up, and they'd have a big drum at the top, and they'd fill that, and people would go and get their water out. Everybody used to take their turn filling up that big drum, and they'd go and draw their water from there. I guess the feeling of freedom, we had a really good feeling here, freedom and people caring and sharing more. None of us had anything, so it set the base to share what we did have. And you were never without somebody caring for you. You never sort of belonged to your parents, you belonged to the whole community. Quite often when we were kids, when the older people were ready to come back here, we'd say, well, can we stay for a while? So it was quite okay for you to stay there with an auntie for a while. And they didn't worry about you because they knew that you were being well cared for. It flooded quite often, and we used to have to move to the high ground over here that we'd call Dasher's Paddock. It was part of the tip over there. And it was like a holiday to us kids to put a little swag on our back and just take our bare necessities and go over there and camp. I remember one time some of the old people waiting outside the school gate for us because the water had come up during the day while we were at school, and the police had come down and told the community that they'd better move out. And what they'd do, they'd pack up beds and things on top of, tables and things like that, and then they'd just take the bare necessities and walk across the highway. And so they came down to the school and told us not to come home here, to go home over there. And I reckon that's fairly significant too, to say, don't go home here, go home over there, because your home was where your people were, Not the material things, home was where the heart is, I guess.
We'll just load up the second one.
I believe the Camarguncha walk-off was a protest.
It was a protest against the treatment they received on the mission. Treatment of not being able to talk their language, not being able to practice anything cultural, and they were harshly penalised if they were caught speaking language or practising anything cultural, to the point of having their rations cut, having the removal of anything they valued. The old people used to go out into the bush of a night time and do their dancing and ceremonies, and the children used to sit around in a circle with possum skin drums and beat the drums. And then missionaries took the drums off them, wouldn't let them make the drums, wouldn't let them use the drums. So my grandmother in her story said that they used to get the pillars and roll them up tight, put them between their legs and beat the pillars in place of the possum skin drums. So they tried very hard to continue their cultural practices. The history should be told right from the very beginning. And the more you can face it, and the more you can acknowledge it, it's a healing process to do that for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Can go through a real healing process once it's put on the table and acknowledged.
So the first of those videos, Aunty, was filmed in 1988, so that's more than 30 years ago, and then the recent one was just last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add to those stories that you told there on those videos today?
I'm trying to prompt myself.
Yes. Well,
Wayne.
yes, thank you, Commissioner Atkinson.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, Council. Just some statistics on that. So the first one was recorded in 1988. That was the year of the bicentenary, a big year, of course, in Aboriginal affairs. That was recorded by the Koori Oral History Program when the program was set up in the State Library. And the other person involved in that was a cousin of ours, Val Heap. And that was for a program that she created at the state, at the museum, because that's when the State Library and the museum were connected together, called Daughters of a Dreaming. 1988, so let's calculate that back. At that time, I was 45 and Sister Girl was 53, to be precise.
And Sister Girl's 87 now.
Thank you.
I'm very lucky to still be here, aren't I, at that age, and to have my faculties. I mean, sometimes they're a bit loose, but in the main I can tighten them up. But I am lucky. You get a little bit frailer in the body as you get older, but I'm very lucky to have it, still have it up here, aren't I? And I'm looking at my grandkids when I say that, because you'll remember that, won't you? That I've still got it up here. So I often wonder how to put it in words, how that has happened to me, because you hear so often of Aboriginal people dying young. And I think to myself now, I'm old now and I'm still here. So it must be somewhere in the genes or something. But because my grandmother, Priscilla, she lived till she was, 96? 96. So I've got a few years to go yet. Yeah.
As well as those two videos, and we've got a third one coming, you made a contribution to some books and other public records, which we've listed in your witness statement. Could you open that folder in front of you, Aunty, and you'll see a tab there, which has got a number 2 on it. Perhaps Wendy could help. I think I've got the video loaded now instead of the photograph, so we'll do the video first and I might come back to this. But just, this is, do you see that? That's a book that she contributed to about 7 years ago, 8 years ago. Yes, and I just want to read to you from the opening passage and then we'll come back to this topic after the video. Do you recognise yourself there, Aunty, in the photograph?
Yeah, I'm with Aunty Nora there.
Yep.
Aunty Nora Nichols.
Um,
Aunty Nora Charles, who Nee Nichols. She was Uncle Doug, Sir Doug Nichols' sister.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So because we've got this video up now, I'll come back to that. So just leave that page open if you wouldn't mind, and we'll come back to that. And we'll play the third video, please.
Okay, well, I'm known as Aunty Faye Carter, and of course the auntie is a respectful term that most younger people use. I've got 2 connections, one Yoorrook and one Yoorrook. I'm very much involved in Yoorrook cultural business. And I was born on Yoorrook country. My mother was living on the Colonisation mission when I was ready to be born. And I always tell people the little story about, in those days, the babies were brought into the world by the old aunties on the mission, but if there was any medical problems, they were taken into the Echuca hospital. And so my mum had some medical problems and she was taken into the Echuca hospital, but I found out many later years that I was born on the veranda because they didn't take the Aboriginal mothers into the wards with the non-Aboriginal mothers. They wouldn't want to do that these days, would they? But it was very common in those days, yes. So I think I was 4 years old when the Colonisation walk-off happened, and most of the families that walked off, and my family was one of them, ended up on going to water. Aboriginal people always went to water, so they ended up along the Goulburn River, the flats. And most people know where the flats are, just outside Mooroopna, not far from Shepparton, and built their homes there out of bags, kerosene tins, went to the tip over the highway to get scrounge for furniture and all sorts of things to make the homes, and they were homes. They were comfortable, warm, loving homes. Yeah. So I always feel as though I was privileged to be raised by all the old people that lived there on the flats, not just your immediate family, but everybody loved and cared and nurtured you. And the old people, my grandmother reared 19 children on that riverbank to keep them away from welfare. And because the mothers and fathers and younger aunties and uncles, they were out picking fruit, out on the tomato patches, trying to make a living, because coming off the mission, where they were taught to be welfare recipients, they had to find ways to survive. And that was one way they were able to make some money to survive. I always tell the story of my grandmother and one of the old aunties went across to the tip, across the river, Dash's paddock, and they came back dragging
and it was a fair distance, a big roll of old lino that somebody had dumped at the tip. And they laid it out, cut it in half, and my nanny put half in one of her big rooms where we all used to gather and eat and sit. And Aunty took the other half and put in her place. Well, people around the flats came to have a look at this lino on the floor, and they thought we were a real flash. Yeah. Oh, extremely important. Going out onto country and walking country is the most wonderful spiritual experience, to actually walk on the country, to walk in the footsteps of your ancestors. You get the feeling of being there with them, of understanding them, of feeling them. To walk country is very, very spiritual, very important. You can talk about country, which is also important, but to walk it and talk it, it's an amazing experience, and I think more people should do that. You can really talk about country when you're on country. Like I'm sitting here now, this is not my country. I appreciate that Wurundjeri people have welcomed us onto their country, but I would be able to talk about country better if I was on my country. But anyway, you can't always do that sort of thing, can you? I do quite often as I can. My son Rodney Carter, he's the CEO of the Yoorrook Aboriginal Corporation, and he's based in Bendigo, so I'm able to go up and stay with him quite often, and yeah, he takes me out to country. I can remember the last time we went up there about 3 or 4 weeks ago. He took me out to the Bendigo Creek, where Yoorrook are making ponds to bring frogs and insects and birds back into the landscape, and I had to walk through grass nearly up to my shoulders. But anyway, he got me through that, and that was a real experience to be able to not just be told about what they're doing, but to go and see what they're doing, and that's important. It is hard to explain, but you get a spiritual feeling. You get a feeling for the people. You get a feeling that they're there, and that you're walking in their footsteps, and that they're walking beside you. And trees, I love the old gum tree, and I can picture so many things happening around a gum tree. It's like if that gum tree is not only part of the landscape, it's part of the people. Very spiritual. Well, the same as what I'm talking about now, that heals you to be on country. It heals you. If you heal country, you heal people. It goes hand in hand. Healing country is healing people. So I think the theme of NAIDOC is really significant to us to say heal country, because it does heal people. If you do something good for the country, you're doing something good for the people. You know, when I drive around, even here in Melbourne, where the infrastructure is so intense, but if I see a nice garden and a lawn and trees, I think, they're looking after country, even in that sort of way, you know. I mean, we're more into being out in the bush, but because of, you know, people living in towns and cities, for them to be looking after their little plot of grass and garden and planting trees, to me that's also healing country in this environment. Oh, I think it's mainly to listen to Aboriginal people. And it sort of goes hand in hand too. Aboriginal people need to bring non-Aboriginal people into the fold, into the country, onto the country, and invite them to come onto country, because I think non-Aboriginal people are a little bit hesitant to go onto country and make out they know everything, you know. So I think to invite non-Aboriginal people onto country, tell them the stories, let them walk country with you, hopefully, and I have experience sometimes with non-Aboriginal people being on country, that they do appreciate it. And I think they do start to feel the feeling of spirituality on country. But I think it's important for us to reach out, put our hands out and invite them onto country and talk about our country and talk about our feelings and let them walk with us, you know. I think that's important.
Thanks,
Paul.
Thanks, Aunty. Is that a convenient time for the morning break?
Yeah.
Yes.
All stand, please. Yoorrook Justice Commission is adjourned until 11:15. Be seated, please. The sitting of the Yoorrook Justice Commission has now resumed.
Do you think it's going okay?
Yes, I just want to make sure the mic is okay for you.
Hello?
Yes, the mic is definitely working, Aunty.
Do you want me to sing Old Shep?
Come forward.
That's Old Shep is an old song, and I always sing it because that's the only song I remember the words of. So wherever I am, you know, people will say, "Oh, Aunty Faye, do you want to sing something?" "Oh, yes, I'll sing Old Shep." But I think it's in my story that I've started to write a song about Yoorrook, and I've done the first verse, and I'm slowly working on what should come next. I want it all to roll into, not to be a long song, but to roll into meaning. And if I could just sing that first verse for
Yes,
you.
please.
Yeah. Look around you and you'll see Aboriginal people just like me. Our colour has faded, our features have changed, but in our hearts our culture remains. And so then I'd like to talk more about what that meant for our culture to remain. Yeah. And I think in my story I've mentioned why I'm talking to or singing to people just about what that means. To look around you and you'll see Aboriginal people just like me. Because it's really hard for us to convince non-Aboriginal people that we are Aboriginal. That's why we say we're Aboriginal, and we continue to say that. We don't have to have black skin anymore. That doesn't mean that you're Aboriginal. It's what's in your heart and your history and your story that means you're Aboriginal. And I know a lot of young people, including my granddaughter, Aunty, they suffer a lot because Aunty's so fair, red hair, blue eyes, but isn't she beautiful? But she finds it very hard to convince people that she is Aboriginal. On both sides, her family, her father, Jar Jar Rung, Yorra Yorra, her mother, Wamba Wamba. So her history is there for her to carry on and hold on to. And it's non-Aboriginal people have to understand us. They need to know our stories. They need to know our feelings. They need to know why we say we are Aboriginal today. And it's very hard for non-Aboriginal people to understand that. Yeah, I think I'm saying the right thing.
Thank you, Aunty. Aunty, you have a brother, Dimsy.
Pardon?
You have a brother,
Dimsy.
yes.
Yes.
And Dimsy and you have a non-Aboriginal father.
Yes.
Do you want to say something about him?
I haven't put him in my story because he's really not important to me. And I say that because he had nothing to do with me growing up, nothing to do with nurturing me. My father, I'm talking about, yeah. Yeah, sorry, yeah. But when he passed away, my brother Dimsy heard about his passing and found out where his funeral was. And so Dimsy said, I think we should go to his funeral out of respect. I wasn't keen on doing that at the time, but I wanted to give Dimsy support because I knew it was important for him. And so we did. We went to the funeral and people were looking at us like if we were aliens. Oh, where did these two come from? Where do they belong? Haven't seen them before. And so we were then asked to go to the wake. So we went to this little house where the wake was. And Dimsy and I were introduced to our father's non-Aboriginal wife and daughter, Anne. They didn't know who we were. They were in shock that we even existed. He had never told them that he'd been married to an Aboriginal woman and that he had 2 Aboriginal children. Never told them. So they didn't know anything about us. They were absolutely in shock. I'm telling this to highlight just how non-Aboriginal men can treat Aboriginal women and Aboriginal families. They're ashamed of them. They're ashamed of saying, oh, I was married to an Aboriginal woman. And so we were never told. They never heard about us. They didn't know anything about us. They were actually in shock about that. So it just highlights to you why I'm saying he's not important in my life, and I didn't want to write him up in my story.
Thank you, Aunty. You said your mum had some medical problems when she was pregnant with you. Could we bring up, please, Annexure A, which is the book that we had open in front of you there. You might not be able to read the ant writing.
Very small, yeah.
But we'll just bring that up on the screen and I'll read it to you if you can't see it on the screen. Yeah, it's very tiny. So if I might read this out to you, because these are your words. I was born on the 1st of January 1935. My mother was living on Cumra Gunja Mission, where I was born. In those days, most of the babies were brought into the world by the old aunties on the mission, but if there were any medical problems, they were taken to the Echuca Hospital. My mum did have some medical problems in her pregnancy with me, so they took her into the hospital. But in those days, they didn't take the Aboriginal women into the wards with the non-Aboriginal women, so I was born on the veranda of the Echuca Hospital. When I was about 16, I started working at the hospital, and my mum was working there as well. And I can remember the day I started, she said, "Fifi, come along and I'll show you a special place." And she took me to that veranda. She said, "That's where you were born, right there." I got a shock and I said, "What, out here on the veranda?" And she said, "Yeah." She didn't think there was anything wrong with that. She thought that was okay. In those days, they just accepted the way they were treated. It was just part of their life. But by then, at that age, I was very much aware of discrimination against our people.
Yeah.
So that story of being born on the veranda and people being treated on the hospital, that's an important story for you, right?
Yes, yes. And I can go on further about that.
Yes.
When we were living down the flats, of course there was many people in the community that became unwell and had to be taken to the hospital. And they were also treated on the verandas. They weren't taken into the wards. They were treated for their health circumstances on the verandas. And when I was 12 years old, I got appendicitis. And I was taken to the Maribna Hospital to have my appendix removed. And I can remember my grandmother whispering to me, "Fifi, don't tell them you're Aboriginal, otherwise you'll end up out on the veranda." And I didn't tell them, but I felt really bad about not telling people that I was Aboriginal. I felt really bad about that. But I knew what my grandmother was saying, and I wanted to keep quiet for her. Yeah.
Would you keep quiet today?
No way, no way. I'm more outspoken now, more confident in speaking out. Our people, throughout their lives, I can see each and every one of our old people, how they were scared. They were scared all the time to speak out. They were frightened of getting into trouble all the time. That was their lives that I can remember growing up, how they felt that they didn't have the right. They didn't have a voice. And I always say, today we are their voices. We are able to speak out. We're able to tell stories. We are able to bring them here with us, bring them along with us. So I think that's important for all of us, for you young ones sitting over there. Never ever be ashamed of saying you're Aboriginal. Tell your story. Tell people who you are, where you come from. And I say to young people, there's a lot of young people that I have the opportunity to speak with. And, most of them don't know their background. They don't know who they are. And I say that to them. You draw yourself a tree and you find out your history. Find out who's on that limb. Who's on that limb? Who's on the base of that tree? Get your story together, get your tree together, and that gives you your strength. That gives you your strength in your Aboriginality and your strength as an Aboriginal person to know who you are, where your roots are, where your history is, how you come by your history. Find it out. That's what will help you throughout your life.
You mentioned being 12 years old with appendicitis. I want to ask you about being 12 years old and dancing. Do you remember dancing as a 12-year-old?
Oh, yes, I do. Yeah, I love to dance. And my grandmother had me taught dancing. And she had me taught dancing because she felt it was a way of me becoming equal in life, equal amongst young people, that I could dance like everybody else. And I became a good dancer, really. And my sister Marlene wanted me to talk about, because she said, if you don't, I will. So I've decided that I better. that when I was 12, my grandmother entered me in a competition at the Shepparton Oval on New Year's Day celebrations. And she entered me in many competitions, but this one in particular, and I did the Highland dancing, Highland Fling, Chartreuse, sword dance, all those dances, which I'd learned from this lady that Nanny used to pay. I'd see her scrounging for those payments for my to take up to the lady who taught me dancing. But anyway, I won Grand Champion of Highland dancing that day at the Shepparton Sports Ground. And I can remember my mother and Aunty Claire was so excited. They kicked their shoes off, grabbed the trophy, the cup, and ran around the oval holding the cup up high for everybody to see. They were so excited about me winning that cup. And I've still got that cup. Yeah.
As well as the Highland dancing, were you doing ballet and tap dancing?
Yes,
Yeah.
I did both that.
And how important was it for your grandmother, this being able to dance as an equaliser?
Yeah, that was very important for her. She's seen that as a way for me to be equal in the community, that I could dance like the other young people who were being taught to dance. And we had, I think I spoke before about, we had many concerts in our community, and we had an old auntie, Aunty Evelyn Briggs. I don't know whether I've spoken about her. I don't know where she got it from, but she had this beautiful way of teaching us how to do ballet. And she was so graceful, and so she taught us ballet dances. I'll just go off track here a little bit.
That's fine.
And just tell that we went to Sydney, a couple of friends and I, to the Sydney NAIDOC ball one year, and Aunty Evelyn by this time had contacted dementia, Alzheimer's, and she was living with her daughter in Sydney. So the two friends and I said, look, while we're here, let's go out and visit Aunty Evelyn and say hello to her, and which we did do. And her daughter said, oh, Mum, you know who these are? And she was looking... Oh, thank you. I've got to sit back a bit. Yeah. Yeah, so Naomi said to her, Aunty Evelyn, Mum, you know who these women are? And she's looking at us very intensely, and she kept on looking and looking at me, and I could see that she knew who I was, but she couldn't think of my name. And so because she had taught us ballet in our younger days, she just went, la, 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 like if she was teaching me to dance. So she did remember who I was.
Did you want to strike a pose when she did that?
Yes, I did.
Can I ask that Annexure B, the photograph, be brought up, please?
I feel better here.
Do you recognise that photo?
Yes,
photo,
I
Aunty?
do. I love that photo.
Tell us about that photograph.
Well, that's my grandmother, Priscilla, sitting at the organ. That's outside the Cumragunja School,
Yes.
where the church group and the choir used to get together, and my grandmother used to play the organ for the choir to sing. That's old Grandpa James there. Sorry.
Just zoom out a little bit.
Yeah, and there's so many beautiful old aunties. A couple of Nanny's sisters I can see there.
Yes.
Aunty Becky and Aunty Louie, and leaning on the organ is Grandpa James, who used to take the services.
Yes.
Over here on the far left is Grandfather Henry Harmony Nelson. It's such a beautiful history photo. Yes.
Grandfathers with the long beard.
Grandfather Henry Harmony with the long beard.
Yes.
Yes. Grey hair, grey beard. And when you look around our family, you can see where that grey hair came from. Yeah, I look at Wayne over there. Yeah. Drew over there. The grey hair comes out. Marlene. Yeah.
So when the old people talk about Kamaragundja, were they talking about it with affection or some other feeling?
My mother used to talk about Kamaragundja like if it was a human being. She'd say, you'd talk about Kamaragundja, something that was happening there, and she'd say, oh, dear old Kamra. Just like if it was a person. Oh, I loved old Kamra. So it was very close to them, that place. Even though there was bad things that happened there must have been very, very good things as well for them to feel like that. But it was country too, wasn't it? You know, it was Yoorrook country.
So just on that, did all the families leave with the walk-off and go to the flats, or did some stay?
No, there was a number of families who stayed behind. As a matter of fact, there's still a couple of families that are still there to this day. Yes. So
And
they were strong people to work through that, yeah.
What was the choice that was being offered? Well, not the choice that was being offered, but what was the choice between staying or going that people made?
I think it depended on how you felt about that sort of life, you know, how strongly you felt about, well, do I want to stay here and be looked after, listen to the bell ringing, queuing up to get the rations, get whatever benefits we needed, or do I go and fend for myself? And I think the families that went off to fend for themselves, even though I think the ones that stayed must have been pretty strong in their own way to go through that, but I think the ones that walked off were stronger to be able to work through surviving in this outside world. You know, Aboriginal people, we've had to walk and live through living in two worlds, the Aboriginal world and the white man's world. We've had to adapt and adopt to do that. I think Aboriginal people are the most adaptable people in the world, the way they've lived and survived through all this that's happened, all the bad policies that were imposed on them.
I'll just ask for the next photograph to be brought up. That's Annexure C. You mentioned the concerts that your aunties and Nanny made costumes for. Just while we bring up that photograph of a ball. So tell us about this photograph.
Okay. Well, that's me in the front doing splits. Many times when people were in a forum somewhere, people see that and they say, "Oh, Faye, can you still do the splits?" Oh, goodness gracious, no. But those costumes that the girls are wearing were all made on that beautiful machine I talked about before, Nanny's precious machine. Old aunties like Aunty Geraldine, Aunty Ollie, they'd do the cutting out of the costumes, and my grandmother would sew them together on that machine. And if there was a concert coming up and they didn't have money to buy materials, they'd get the crepe paper, the coloured crepe paper. You know, you could get it in green, red, yellow, blue, and Nanny had cut costumes out of that paper and sewed them up on that sewing machine. She was very clever.
Thank you, we can take that. Oh, is there anyone else in that photograph you want to tell us about?
Well, they're all past now,
I see.
bar the one at the back on the left, Aunty Frances Matheson. She's still alive, living in the Rumballara nursing home in Cheverton. I think she would be about 94 now. And of course me. And we're still here, but all the rest have passed on. And let me tell you, there's a story to each of those lives. I know that I think it'd be all right to say it, that Aunty Lois Peeler is going to be part of the truth telling, and the little lass behind me there on the right in the front, that's her sister, Leah. That's her younger sister. And Frances Matheson, who I just mentioned, is in her 90s now, the only one alive. That's Lois's elder sister. So isn't it amazing how families come out of photos like this? Yeah.
So we'll remember to ask Aunty Lois about that and about the photograph.
Yeah.
And
And the one next to Frances, Hillet Maras, that's another sister of Lois's. She was the founder of Yoorrook College, the Aboriginal College in Hillsville. She was the founder of that, yeah.
So the commissioners will hear some evidence about the college and that family as well. So thank you for sharing that. I want to ask you now about working part-time in retail when you're only 14 years old. So can you tell us about your job in the fruit and vegetable shop?
Yeah, well, I think I might have been the only Aboriginal girl working in a shop at that time. Later on, my sister Marlene began work in a butcher shop. Yeah, later on. But yeah, I was the first Aboriginal girl to have a job in the town. And I don't know whether I'd set an example with that or not, but I think over time I may have set an example of what you can achieve. Yeah.
Was there a reason why Aboriginal people weren't employed in retail that you know about?
Oh, it'd be mainly because seeing an Aboriginal person up front serving food in particular, non-Aboriginal people wouldn't want to eat that food or touch that food because it had been handled by this Aboriginal person, you know. So, yeah, I think shop owners were very lax to employ Aboriginal people in their business, in their shops.
Did you experience any racism in that work that you were doing in the fruit and vegetable shop?
Oh, yes, yes. Just what comes to mind is not there at the moment, but yes. I mean, my mother-in-law, she was a very racist old lady. I can remember when my husband told her that he was going to marry me, she said, "Oh, no, no, no. I don't want any little pickaninnies running around my backyard." And she was a dressmaker, and she used to make me dresses. And she used to say, "Now, Faye, I'm making you these clothes so that you dress properly when you go down the street and go shopping, so that you look like everybody else." I thought I did look like everybody else anyway, in my own way.
What about how people were served in the shops as customers? What's your memory of how Aboriginal people were served when they...
Oh, look, I remember going shopping when we lived down the flats with Nanny and a couple of old aunties, and we'd go down the street in Maroubna shopping. we'd go into a shop, and if there were non-Aboriginal people in there being served, our old people were asked to stand up against the wall, stand back until all the non-Aboriginal people were served. So they were treated second-class citizens to the very hilt. And if they were called forward to be served after non-Aboriginal people were finished being served, they could have been serving somebody when another non-Aboriginal person walked in. They'd stop serving that Aboriginal person to serve the white person first. And so, what a racist act that was for our people to suffer. But they didn't complain about it. They didn't make a fuss about it. They just did what they were told, really. Sadly.
Was it just the case in the shops or with other?
No, it was in doctors' surgeries, in the hospital, any business that they went into. They were treated second class, keep your place, stand back, go behind there. Yeah.
I want to ask you about your auntie, Ruby Muir. Are you happy to tell the story about Auntie Ruby Muir?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I like her story to be told. Auntie Ruby was with her two brothers, Uncle Charlie and Uncle Billy. When they were children, they were brought by paddle steamer down from Barkindji country to Cumraguncha and taken out to the mission. My grandmother adopted Auntie Ruby. She was a little girl then, I'd say 5 or 6 or 7. And so Nanny adopted Auntie Ruby into our family, and she was seen as my mother's eldest sister. And that's how I grew up thinking who she was. It wasn't until I was married, actually, which was back in 1954. I think I was 25. Was I 20? In my 20s anyway. Sorry. And that I found out that she wasn't my mother's blood sister, that she'd been adopted into the family. And so, of course, time went on and Auntie Ruby became very frail and ended up in a nursing home in Maribna. And a cousin of mine, Lillian Tamaroo, we used to go up and visit her. But prior to that, she had a niece, Uncle Charlie's daughter, Kerry Muir, who researched what had happened to Auntie Ruby and Uncle Charlie, why they were taken by paddle steamer off country down to Cumraguncha Mission. And the research ended up showing that their mother had been massacred in a massacre on Barkindji country. And the children were found hiding in a water tank. And so the police took the children, put them on the paddle steamer, and they were taken down to Cumraguncha Mission. And Auntie Ruby, okay, she's in her 90s now when she's in that nursing home. And at that age, she was still asking the question, why did my mother give us away? So, hearing this story that Kerry had researched, Lily and I were able to go to the nursing home, and even though Auntie Rube was very frail, the bedclothes pulled up close around her face, very, very frail, we were able to tell her her story. That her mother didn't give her away, that her mother had been massacred and died. That's why she was put on the paddle steamer and sent down to Cumraguncha. And she pulled the bedclothes down, put her hand out and grabbed hold of mine and Lillian's hand, as much as say thank you for telling me my story. Oh, that was a wonderful outcome, really, to know that we were able to tell her before she passed, because she passed next morning, that her mother hadn't given her away, that and what had happened to her mother. That was wonderful for us to be able to do that. And she was a beautiful lady. I think there's a photo of her there somewhere.
Could we bring up Annexure D, please? I'll show that photograph. So Aunty Ruby's in that photo?
Yeah, holding the cat, nursing the cat.
Who else is in this photograph?
Okay, well, there's Grandfather Henry Harmony, and leaning on his knee is Uncle George Nelson, Mummy's brother. Then there's Aunty Ruby holding the cat. Then there's Granny Mag with my mother sitting on her knee. It's my mother sitting on her knee. Uncle Bill Onus is over here. Behind Granny and Grandpa is Aunty Margaret. Standing next to her is Nanny Priscilla, in her young days. What a beautiful old photo. Yeah.
Story of Margaret.
Commissioner Atkinson.
The story of Margaret,
Yeah.
stolen, taken away.
Okay. Yeah.
So would you tell us the story about Aunty Margaret?
Yeah. This is another sad story. Aunty Margaret, of course, was one of Grandfather Henry and Granny Mag's daughters. They had two daughters. And they took girls at that time from the mission and sent them to a training place, really, called Cootamundra, and where many Aboriginal girls were taken, and they were trained as maids, really, housekeepers. So Aunty Margaret was taken there to Cootamundra with many other girls from the mission. And sometime after she'd been there, Granny Mag and Grandfather Henry got word from the place in Cootamundra that Aunty Margaret was coming home for a holiday on the train. So they went by gig, horse and gig, into the Echuca railway station to meet Aunty Margaret. Aunty Margaret didn't get off the train, but her bag was put off onto the station, and Granny Mag and Grandfather recognised the bag. Finding out later that Aunty Margaret had passed away and that she'd been buried up there somewhere. And they'd never been told any of this. Never were they told that their daughter had passed away and that she'd been buried. And it disturbs me even today, and I'm sure it disturbs many other people in our family, that we still don't know what she died of and where she's buried. And I'm hoping, and I've spoken to Nick about this, I'm hoping that one day we can find that out and have some closure and be able to go and visit where she's laid to rest, because we don't know this. How cruel can people be? And doesn't it highlight how racist people can be, that they don't think it's important for Aboriginal people to know these things, that they can just do these things and get away with it? So I hope one day we can have closure by finding out where she's laying to rest, so that we can go and visit, have a ceremony with her, sit on the ground with her and talk to her. I'm sure she'll be able to talk back to us in some way. Yeah, I hope that can happen.
I hear that there's a possibility that you have we might have in time for today, a tape of your grandmother talking in language. Have you heard that tape?
Yes, I have. And that tape was made back in the 60s by a researcher called Elizabeth Hercus. Louisa Hercus. The Yoorrook had a language book developed and established, and Margaret Wirrapunda and I, we wanted to know how this linguist came by so much of the Yoorrook language. So we asked to meet with her, and yeah, she agreed to meet with us, and we sat down and we asked her the question, how did you come by so much of the Yoorrook language for this book to be established? And she said, oh, research. I did lots and lots of research. I got a lot of tapes from the Institute of Aboriginal Studies in Canberra. And she leaned down and pulled out of her bag 3 tapes, and she put them on the table. And she said, as a matter of fact, I've got 3 tapes here with me that helped us with the language. And I said, oh, who's on the tapes? And one of them was my grandmother, who I'd never heard speak language, ever. So it was a very emotional time for me to hear that tape. So she could see how emotional it made me. And she said, here, you have the tape. She probably had another half a dozen in her bag, but that was okay. She gave me that one. I think Aunty Jerry and Uncle Sally, Lois's mother and father, I think they're on a tape. They've got a tape. And I can't recall who the third one was.
That's okay. If we can't organise it in time today, we can make sure it forms part of your evidence later on. Okay, we can tender that later.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. How is it, is there a difference listening to your grandmother speaking in language from how she used to speak to you in English?
Oh, a big difference. It was so noticeable to me because Nanny had a very, what could I call it, gruff, sort of strong voice, you know, making you sit up and take notice and hear what she was saying. And so she spoke in that sort of way. But on this tape, hearing her speak language, it was this soft voice we could hear. Just so different, you know, how she spoke language.
Did you have some words here and there of language growing up from the old people?
Yeah.
And so,
like we referred to, you might have heard, Dominini Alga, my precious baby, precious one, precious something. That's very, very much used, still used. Even the young people have come up with that now, and I'm pleased to hear them say that, refer to one another as Dominini Alga. Meat, Jidika. Yeah. Mama? Sorry.
are you okay to continue, Aunty?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you talked about the reason you think the old people didn't speak language to you as children. What about practice of culture?
same thing. They didn't want us to get into trouble. But gosh, we've revived so much of that song and dance in a cultural way. We've revived that language. Judge Overall have got a language committee now, so that's good, and it's it sort of really gets to me that, you know, how we as old people, we teach young people. Now the young people are teaching us language. So that's very, it's good to hear, really. But it sort of shakes you up a bit.
You mentioned also that the kids would pull the pillows off the bed and make drums out of the pillows. You mentioned that.
Yeah.
Did they also do ceremony?
Oh, they would have, yes.
And did they have to do that in secret or?
Oh, gosh, yes. Out in the bush, yeah. Like, there's a whole story that Wayne could tell very well of grandfather James, who taught school on the mission, and they weren't allowed to teach longer than grade 3. And if he could see young Aboriginal people with potential, he built what they call the little scholars hut in the way out in the bush. And he used to take young Aboriginal people who he seen had potential into that scholars hut of night time and teach them further education. Yeah.
What happened if they were caught teaching language, or speaking in language, or teaching culture?
Well, as I mentioned before, it was to do with taking rations off them, taking things of value off them that they valued. That sort of, that sort of punishment.
What's happened to the land at Kamargunja? Was it still there, the whole land area?
No. It was very much decreased, particularly after the war, when part of Kamargunja was cut up into land parcels and given to the returned soldiers. And of course we had Aboriginal soldiers who returned from war, but they weren't given any land. They weren't considered for that. So Kamargunja lost a lot of land through that, giving away. And I can remember grandfather James was given, because he worked for the education department teaching school, when he retired he was given a parcel of land across the river from Kamargunja on the Barmer side.
Who was he given that by?
The education department, because of his services to Kamargunja's education.
But that was not related to any war service?
No. That was just given to him. I can remember when we first walked off the mission, we camped across there on Grandpa's land for a while before we moved down to the flats.
Tell us about Uncle Doug Nichols and his role on the mission.
We always referred to Uncle Doug as the policeman on the mission, actually, because he used to make sure that everything was followed by the law. But because children were being taken away in those days, he'd watch for welfare, and the big black Mariah, we called it, that used to bring the welfare people down to the mission. He had a white horse and he used to ride the horse around the mission, keeping an eye on everything. And if he seen that black Mariah coming, he would then warn people on the mission, Barramandine coming, Barramandine coming. That means the police, the welfare are coming, so that they would hide the children, swim them across the river, so that the welfare wouldn't take the children away.
And was he successful warning the kids?
I think so. Not in every case, probably, but mostly, yeah.
Just coming back to the topic of racism, what have you learnt in terms of keeping things clean from that, from your early experiences?
Yeah, I guess you can call them. I'm a cleaner from way back, really. I clean. It's very important to me to clean and have things clean. And I always say that psychologically, I think it comes from something that happened to me as a child. Going to school in Maroubna, we used to go as a big group, you know. We'd keep together as a group and walk up to the school and stay together. And on the fence would be a group of non-Aboriginal children, and they'd be chanting, "Here come the dirty blacks from the flats." And I always say psychologically, I think that's stuck in my head. Nobody's going to call me a dirty black ever again. That's why I clean.
Do you believe racism is still alive and well?
Sure is. It's alive and well, but it's more covert. It's harder to find. But I tell you what, us old people, we can read it like a book. We can find it. But it's hard for young people to understand and see and find out, oh, that's being racist. That's not how it should be. But they get away with it more these days, because it's covertly practiced. It's not out in the open like it used to be, like, you know, putting you on the veranda to be cared for and all that sort of stuff, you know. That was more out in the open. Now it's not. It's more undercurrent.
Do you want to share the story about your nephew Luke and his daughters coming back to Australia from America and being educated?
Oh, their daughter, Zoe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my sister Marlene's son, Luke, and his wife, when they came back, and Luke, can I tell you, is a heart specialist. How wonderful is that, you know, to have that in our family. But anyway, him and his wife and two little girls, the youngest one, Zoe, came back to live in Melbourne for a while. And Luke worked at the Royal Melbourne while he was here, actually, as a heart specialist, cardiologist, I think they call it. And so his little girl, Zoe, had an incident at school which was very, very traumatic for her, where she got up and said she was Aboriginal, she was Yoorrook, Judge Aboriginal, and she was told to sit down by the teacher and almost said, "Don't tell lies in the class." This really upset Zoe. She went home and told her father. Of course, her father got upset as well. He went to his mother, Marlene, told her, and she got upset. Yeah, because she's like me. Here, look, strong. So she went to the school and she gave them a serve and a half. And so Murrumbindi Hunter, a Wurundjeri cultural man, does a lot of cultural programs. Marlene got in touch with him and told him what had happened to Zoe at the school. Would he go to the school? So he did. He went to the school and he provided a cultural program for the school. And Marlene was really pleased with that and thanked him very much for doing that. But why should he had to do that, if teachers had been taught not to be racist in their training, why should we have to, after they've been trained, give them cultural programs? It should come as part of their training when they're being taught as teachers, as doctors, as nurses, as lawyers. Anybody that's going through the education department should have a component of Aboriginal cultural history and awareness built into their training. Not go through their training, then come out and expect Aboriginal people to provide them with cultural awareness. Isn't that back to front? You know, I hope that can change. I really do, because it's the wrong way to go about it. I mean, if you're going to learn, if you're going to be taught properly. And our history at the moment is being taught in little raggy components, taught by a teacher that maybe is sensitive towards Aboriginal people, and she'll include a program in her class, but it'll be about one little thing about Aboriginal people. Our history needs to be told from start, from the very beginning through to now. It should be done properly in, what's that word I'm looking for?
Sequence or chronological
Context.
order?
Chronological. Yeah, it should be told right from the very beginning, right through, so that it, and it should be told and taught to these people who are being educated for all these different things we have to do with, like teachers, doctors, nurses, lawyers. It should be built in, and it should be built into schools too. You know, our history is not in the curriculum. It is to this very day, our history is not in the curriculum. It needs to be compulsory. It needs to be written into the curriculum of the education department. I wished I was younger, that I could sort of fight more for these sorts of things.
Just on that, you have fought for a long time in a number of different roles, and I want to just touch on those now, if I may. In the 1980s, you were working with the Aborigines Advancement League, and could you tell the Commission what role you had and what that work involved?
Well, it was welfare support, and so there was 3 of us employed as what they call field officers in those days, me and 2 other men, and the Aborigines Advancement League didn't just cover welfare support within the metropolitan area, they covered the whole of Victoria. And so as field officers, we had to travel around the whole of Victoria to give welfare support and respond to requests for welfare in all sorts of areas. Families looking for food, families looking for transport to get to a funeral or get to a loved one's sick bed, or all that sort of welfare support we gave. I covered, not only in those days, and I'm talking about the late 70s, early 80s, that we were field officers doing that sort of work around Victoria, but all throughout my life I've worked in those sorts of situations, and as a matter of fact, in April 2019 I received the Order of Australia Medal for my services to the Victorian Aboriginal community, and It's there in my bag somewhere. I don't sort of show it off. I feel a little bit that I am showing off if I wear it. But it's an acknowledgement, really, of the work that I've done throughout my life. Which,
An acknowledgement, Aunty, of decades of service.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's what it is. That's what it says in the write-up. Yeah.
And are you still connected to those offering those services to Aboriginal people?
Gosh, in a way, yes. Without knowing it, you know, you still get, because I've been involved in the community for so long, I think people still see me as being able to help with some sort of welfare support, because that's been my role, you know. And I will do that if I can, you know. Look, 2 years ago now, I had a knock on my door, 10 o'clock at night. Young woman standing there at my door. I won't mention any names. She said, "Aunt, the department have taken my 2 children off me." She had a little boy and a little girl, toddlers. The little girl, she was still, you know, very, very young. And she said, and they've taken them away. And I said, okay, what happened? She was living with a non-Aboriginal, young non-Aboriginal chap, and they got on the ice. And she quite openly telling me this. She said, we got on the ice and we played up. And we started arguing and throwing things around, and neighbours could hear what was going on. They rang the police. And so the police came, and the first thing the police did was take the children for safety, I guess. And she said, will you help me get my children back? And I said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll talk to the department and I'll work with you for a couple of weeks and just see if you are prepared to behave yourself, really, and look after your children properly. So 11 o'clock that night, the department turned up to my house with 2 little toddlers and a cot and a bottle and, you know, some baby's food. 11 o'clock at night. So I took those 2 children and I looked after them for 2 weeks. And I let the mother come and we talked through all this. And look, I could see, just witness how she cared for those children and how they loved her, that she was a good mother. She'd just been caught up with something that had got her into trouble. And I just felt it so clearly within myself that she would not do that again, that she would be a good mother and look after her children. So I talked the department into, for those reasons, I talked the department into giving her children back, which they did do. And to this very day, I mean, they're nearly teenagers now. Oh no, they're not really. They're big kids now, okay? So, yeah, every now and again I'll get something that requires I respond in some way if I can. Butulin. People look for butulin all the time. Butulin in Yoorrook language is money. Yeah, people look for a bit of a handout. Hand up. Yeah.
How is it for you reflecting back on those decades working in welfare?
How?
Yeah, how is it for you? What's the impact on you of that work over decades?
It is. It becomes stressful at times, depending on the case, depending on the situation, of how you let it affect you. But if you take on that sort of role and that sort of work, you've got to become strong enough to deal with it and not let how you feel interfere with what you're going to or have to give. You have to be strong enough to do it without falling to bits, you know.
Just on a couple of other things, you were involved in the native title negotiations for the Dja Warren traditional owners, and you served a couple of terms on ATSIC as a councillor.
Yeah, that's way, way back.
Yeah. And you've also held various roles on advisory committees and boards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you tell us the story about the repatriation of the Jarrah baby?
Yeah. Well, that's another sad story. The Jarrah baby was found by a wood chopper, and of course in those days they used to bury mainly children, I think, up in trees, high up in trees. And this wood chopper chopped down a tree, and he was actually on Dja Warren country, chopped down a tree, and the Jarrah baby fell out of the tree in a possum skin cloak, very dilapidated possum skin cloak. And so he picked her up and took her to the police station, and the police station ended up taking her to the museum, the Melbourne Museum. She was put in a metal drawer. She laid in that drawer for nearly 100 years until we found out what had happened to the Jarrah baby. So we went to the museum and, yeah, we put on a dance up and down, bang, 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 and to get the baby back and rebury her. And so we were, after some time of negotiating with the museum, we were able to get them to agree to give her back to us. And she must have been very important because in her wrapping there was a number of little items that had been wrapped with her, gifts, which made us think, oh gee, she must have been important to get these sort of gifts. And so we said, the museum said, oh, you can take the baby, but you can't take the gifts. We need to keep them in the museum for show. And we hadn't finished investigating, researching them. And we said, look, that'd be like stealing from her. That'd be like stealing her lovely gifts from her if you don't allow us to let her keep them. They ended up agreeing after some time to let us keep the gifts with the baby. So because the possum skin she'd been wrapped in was very dilapidated, we got another good possum skin, and Lillian Tamaroo and I went to the museum and we re-wrapped her. We re-wrapped her with her goods in the new possum skin. And we were able to take her back to country, and we found the tallest tree that we could find that was very similar to the one that had been chopped down. And luckily, the people who owned that property were very nice, sensitive, understanding people, and they allowed us to use one of these trees. We had to get a cherry picker out there because we wanted to put her as high as we possibly could. And so that's what we did. We had a ceremony around the tree, a group of us Dja Warren people, and we placed the Jarrah baby back in the tree. And there she rests. And we're entitled by the people who own the property to go at any time and spend some time at that tree. Yes.
The Commissioners have heard many stories about people dying away from country in places that are not known or places that are unmarked as graves. Could you just tell us how important it is for people to be returned to marked graves or marked places of rest and to be taken back to country?
Oh, it's very important to go back to country. It's the same as when you're alive, walking country, that you can now rest in country. That's where you will find perfect peace, to be laying in country. That's about all I can say about it, that it's just so important that we do that. Some people, you cannot always take people back to country. But I've just got a feeling that if you don't be placed on country, that you never have total peace. And when you've got, like I have, two connections, Yoorrook and Jajjarum, you have to make a decision then, you know, which country will I go to, but they're both very important to me because they both belong to grandparents. Those two countries belong to grandparents and family. And so I don't think it matters which country you go on, as long as you feel. I've told my family where I want to go, and it's a cemetery where I think I counted up, I've got some 12, 13 family members buried in there. So I feel as though I'm going back with them. And yeah.
How important is it for you to remember the past, the stories of the past?
It's very important, really. Your past is your future. So you've got no future if you don't remember your past. It's and you have to remember your past. Otherwise you leave your ancestors behind, your old people behind. You've got to remember your past and your stories. That's who you are. And you can't be who you are without remembering your past.
Aunty, it's just about lunchtime. There's a few other things I wanted to ask you, but we should have a conversation over lunch about some sensitive evidence you want to give when we come back, okay? So we'll have a break for lunch now if that's a convenient time. And when we come back, we'll let the Commission know how we want to hear that sensitive evidence, okay?
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.